I think I accidentally set up the live stream a bit earlier as well, and I don't know if this will kind of like if it'll link up right.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay, so we're live now. My voice goes as soon as we start. And I'm talking to Dr. Josh Rasmussen. Where is it that you're teaching at the minute, actually? Philosophy.
Azusa Pacific University in Southern California.
And are you teaching specifically like philosophy of religion or just general philosophy, metaphysics and stuff?
Yeah, so I teach an array of courses, intro to philosophy, which covers kind of the main topics. And then I'll also do upper division. Sometimes I'll do a mind course. I've done a free will course. And I will also teach like big questions in the philosophy of religion as well.
So I guess how did I just reach out to you and say, did you fancy a chat, or?
I don't know. I think we just connected by Facebook, kind of mutual interest, I think, and just had a few little exchanges there. And then you mentioned your show. I remember seeing one of your shows about like how to engage in a disagreement productively. And I thought, wow, that's just awesome. And so I was pretty excited about what you're doing on your show. So
yeah, that was with the pleasure of that one. And that was really quite interesting as well. I don't know if he does philosophy because he knows quite a lot about it, but yeah, he had some really cool ideas. So I guess we're just going to talk about anything, right? And initially,
yeah, I don't. Go ahead.
You were saying like maybe talking about how we can know, and I think for me, for people who have like been watching me and my kind of journey, a big part of, you know, I think coming into Christianity a couple of years ago, I assumed a lot of my conclusions because I wanted them to be true and was reasoning from that. And I think I came to realize that's what I'm doing. And a lot of the things I'm saying, I know, you know, like I'm not being fair with the evidence here. Like I'm like, oh yeah, the ontological argument's really good. And then someone would say something that I didn't know about, like truth makers that I hadn't like learned about yet. And I'd be like, oh yeah, that's just like, that's just stupid. Or, like someone had raised biblical textual criticism objection or something, I'd just be like, yeah, that's just liberals who rejecting God in their mind. And and I was being too overconfident with what I didn't know, kind of thing.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, the other thing that makes it challenging to get to truth is that there's some things that are kind of familiar, and because they're based on your own experiences, and then the things that are unfamiliar, it's easy to sort of discount them as being less sort of evidential, or to tell a story about the minds and motives of people who hold the less familiar views. And so then you almost kind of barricade yourself from expanding your vision, because you're almost like always sort of seeing it from your original vision, filling in details, protecting that vision. And I think that that is a barrier to growth and to truth. And I don't know, actually, before our time together, I was just like thinking, do I have a kind of like message or point? And I don't know, I mean, in a way, I don't really have an agenda, but maybe I do have one thought that I want to express this to you, and maybe this will unfold in the conversation, which is just that I feel like your journey, and not just your journey, but like my journey and the journey of the people in the audience, like that is very important. The journey itself is very important, because it's like in the journey, you are developing truth-seeking virtues, like courage to face reality. You're navigating complexity, you're building out your mind, building out your worldview. And I think sometimes, and I'm prone to this, you know, as a philosopher, I want to know what's true. Truth is sort of my aim. And sometimes I think that I've found some truth, and some truths seem very important. So I put sort of a golden circle around those truths, and I feel like, this is what you need to get. And sometimes this actually can lead me to almost like not value that process, the process of seeking and growing. And I have to tell you, it seems like all the views that I've arrived at currently are views that I didn't used to have. So, I mean, there's always growth. There's always like more room to grow. And I'm always in development. So I kind of want to almost maybe start with that, you know, just like the journey itself is very valuable. Like it's a good process, and it takes certain kind of courage to even be comfortable with uncertainty. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Do you approach this like from the philosophical point of view of like epistemology? Like, is this like virtue epistemology? Or because like something I noticed in reading how reason can lead to God is it's like it seems to me like some of what you're trying to do is talk about things in this type of terms that we actually use in language rather than the types of terms that philosophers use.
Yeah.
Where you're, a well-formed formula or a well-defined whatever is a well-defined, and it like you're talking to some kind of AI robot or something to actually understand. And
sometimes I'll write like a formula on the board and I'll tell my students, and I'll symbolize it with the triangles, and I'll tell my students, this is what we do, make ourselves feel more significant, because it looks sophisticated. Doesn't necessarily help. It can, but not necessarily.
And is that some of what you're trying to do in this like approach, is take maybe like, would you say you agree to virtue epistemology as something in the realm of philosophy, but then what you're trying to do is normalize that so as it can actually be lived out almost like in the way that like the proper Greek philosophy, where it's like a way of life almost.
Yeah, no, I like how you put that, because something I was telling one of my friends is that if you think of tools to help you to be more powerful in getting to truth, one set of tools would be like the epistemological theories. Like, so it's like, what's the correct theory of how you get knowledge? But another set of tools would be just like virtues, which are basically just attitudes. Am I loving truth or am I loving to protect my argument? Sometimes you have to make a choice there, and only you can sort of be aware of that internal tension. Am I willing to be wrong? Am I humble? And I feel like these kinds of virtues, it seems to me, are really the most powerful. Like, they will help you in the longest term. And I do try to do that in my book. I try to almost like stay away from technical jargon and not sort of hide behind. I think sometimes there's a way in which you can kind of remove yourself from reality by getting overly technical. And I want to go back to the original terms. It's not to say that we can't also have technical formula for this. I like to have both. If you can have a common sense interpretation and the technical formula in the background, and that maximizes, I think, the likelihood that you're on the right path. But I think even more than being on the right path is like just having the right attitudes, being willing to be wrong. I've been on the wrong path. I'm surely on some wrong paths now. And I want to find that out fast. How am I going to do that if I'm not willing to be wrong?
So I think for most people who are like, I've got a good mix of like Christians and atheists and stuff who watch, but I think for most of the more skeptical people, they would be like, well, if this guy's a Christian, right? Isn't he assuming those conclusions? Isn't he working towards them? So how do you then balance this kind of view of truth, or I could be wrong? Like, does that extend to all of even like these really important things about the ultimate nature of reality?
Yeah, for me it does. Hold no belief sacred. Open everything for testing. Otherwise, for me, like, I would have this worry, like, how can I know this is true? Especially if it was something that was sort of given to me in a kind of safe community where, like you said, you might even want it to be true. And it's like, well, this is just my starting point. I will never even test it. Well, for me, I feel anxious about that. It's like, well, maybe that, other people disagree with me. So I want to like enter their perspective and really just test that out. And I think that's really important. And I feel like actually that worry that somebody sort of starts with the viewpoint and then sort of fences it through reason, maybe kind of rationalizes it. I think that worry is very important. I think it actually signals a virtue, the people who have that worry. And I'll just be very honest, Nathan, because sometimes I'll see people express this worry, and I think it comes from a courage to face reality. And then I'll sometimes see a kind of response to these people as almost like they're the enemy. And there becomes like a sort of a battle of ideas, which is unhelpful. And I feel like, no, like, let's put down our weapons and like, let's come together and let's look at this with fresh eyes. I remember one time, just a little story if I could share. I came home from a vacation, and this was back when my wife and I, we were at Notre Dame, and we were living in this small little house, and we came back from a vacation, and I saw from our car before we came back inside that our door was open. The front door was open. And I was like, oh, why is the front door open? We'd been gone for like a week. And so I came in, okay, wife, you stay in the car. I think we had a child at the time. Stay in the car. I went in, and the first thing I noticed was our TV was gone. And then other things were gone. So I started forming beliefs, right? So I formed the belief that somebody had come in. And since this might sound a little silly to you, but like somehow I formed the belief they came in through the front door because it was open.
Right.
And then they stole some things. And then I saw the back window broken. So since I had these prior beliefs, they led me to infer that, oh, they must have went out the back window. They must have busted the back window and took the stuff out there.
Right.
And then within 1 second, I was like, no, it goes the other way. They came in through the back window and then came out the front door. But I had to actually rethink that, and it was because there's almost like a priority to previous beliefs. And so when you start with previous beliefs, it's like you want to build the new beliefs in terms of the previous ones. It takes work. I mean, that's sort of a simple example where you can sort of see it. But when you're building a whole worldview, a whole system of thought, and then you come to new data that's more complex, there's always ways that you can sort of integrate the complex data without giving up your original framework. And so you can sort of keep protecting it. But, sometimes the original framework was wrong, and you have to almost put it to the side for a moment, even to just look at it from another perspective. It's not to say that you necessarily have to stop believing everything, but just kind of put it on the table for fresh investigation. It takes work.
Yeah, when you were articulating that analogy, it kind of reminded me of, there's that thing David Hume says about our reasoning being inference-based, and if there's one of the earlier ones is wrong, we can be out by quite a lot. Or the other one is, I know you defend the correspondence theory, but coherentists, when they use the ship of Theseus example or whatever, when they talk about, if you take out some of those bottom planks, what kind of happens to that coherent raft, as it were.
You start with sort of common sense beliefs, and then you start working on it, and it's wait a minute.
Yeah. And I just reflecting on normal, outside of the context of philosophy, I think it's so true that we all the time just have these random why people are acting the way they are, and it is really closely linked to the moral realm, right? It's oh, that person is looking at me because I did that, and they probably just don't care about what you're doing. But constant belief forming in ways that aren't necessarily accurate or truthful, and if just on that small scale it can be wrong, then on that kind of larger scale it can be so much further out. So how do you go about approaching when you've got people at such diametric opposites? So the people who just to say, assuming kind of natural, as soon as you start bringing virtues and things into it, well morals don't exist, I don't care, or whatever. Or at the other end, maybe people who say, your reason is corrupted by sin, what you're doing is you're putting God on trial by thinking how do you then actually approach dialogue with all these people to actually get to some useful conclusions?
Yeah, so I feel for me, kind of the number one thing is to kind of see them as an ally instead of sort of on the other side of a fence, and to sort of take some time to enter into their perspective. And I kind of like looking for common ground. I'm sort of fascinated by, okay, what are some things that they already think are true? And then can I sort of build a bridge from what they think is true to what I think is true? And and if I can't do that, I mean, then that reinvites me to consider, my own view, if I can't build that bridge. And I mean, I could tell you many stories of views where I changed my view because I couldn't build a bridge. And so it got me to rethink that. But I would say that's one thing, is to really, in that complex conversation, to sort of work together and to look for the common ground. And by the way, I mean, this sort of, you mentioned Christianity, and I know that sort of in your audience, there might be this sort of atheist Christian divide, but I find that this sort of contest of ideas replays itself on every significant question. So in the philosophy of mind, there are different viewpoints. In the philosophy of time, there are different viewpoints. And there tends to be almost this kind of easy polarization where you have people, obviously everybody thinks they're right, and then the people on the other side are sort of behind a fence. And you start to fill in maybe some demonizing reasons why they're confused. And I find that that's a big barrier to truth. I mean, we could talk about epistemological theories like internalism, externalism, different theories of how you get to truth. But I really think that across those theories, what matters more are just these virtues and kind of putting down the weapons, holding no belief sacred. I mean, Nathan, I heard that line first the first time I ever heard that was from atheists talking about how we need to like now hold our religious beliefs sacred. We need to put everything to testing. And they're like, that's beautiful. Like, I agree with that. That's good. And so that's where, I don't know, like for me, that's like atheists being salt and light in my life. You know, they're helping me see something good and valuable. And I really mean that, because I think that we all start off with views that are limited. We never, this goes back to my kind of my main thought is that the journey matters so much because there's always more to see. Like no matter how much you have seen, there's always more to see. And so if you sort of get stuck, a way to get out of that, I think, is to subject everything to more investigation.
And how do you think though we sort of can go about that? Because so say one of some of my most frustrating kind of examples I've come across tend to be on like YouTube and the internet. So typical kind of debunk type videos, or there was one I saw, I don't know if you saw, and I really like T-Jump, but when he interviewed Bernardo Kastrup, who's, as far as I'm aware, isn't a theist, but he's an idealist. And I was watching the chat, and so, you know, someone in the chat is going, blah, 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 no matter, therefore God, heard it all before. And it's like, this guy isn't, as far as I'm aware, I could be completely wrong, but I was like, I don't even think he's a theist. He's just genuinely come to a different conclusion. And like, he's got a PhD in computer science as well. He clearly is familiar with the sciences and the material world and how it works, probably more than most of the audience. And yet he's come to this, like, don't you want to listen to what he's got to say rather than, for a lot of people, that's very difficult. How do you actually go about getting someone to see things in that way, to want to be charitable in the conversation, to want to you know, not be so dogmatic or aggressive and stuff, if that is the case? How would you actually practically do that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm still a work in progress on this. I mean, I'm learning, I'm experimenting, I'm trying some things. Some things seem to be more helpful than others. I've also come to kind of recognize that different people have different purposes, and that's okay. I think there is a place for maybe a certain kind of contest where it's kind of a game, like people are playing a game, and that's okay. Games are cool. But like if we want to come together and sort of maximize the flow of ideas across each other, so we're both growing, we're both expanding, we're both clarifying our view. One thing that I do find helpful is to try to distinguish the person from their view, so that when I'm analyzing their view, I'm not critiquing them. And because I think what happens is it's easy to kind of like put your view inside your heart and then feel like if somebody's attacking your view, you are under attack. And really just to distinguish the view from the person, I think goes a long way. And sometimes that means, you know, even putting myself outside of whatever view I have, and maybe even using a little bit of a third person. We're like, well, here are some different models, and like, let's look at these together. So that's one thing that can help. I mean, I don't know. The different cases are different, you know, and different people are different. I feel like some people, they're kind of more philosophically minded in the sense that they want to sort of see it for themselves. Whereas I think some people are a little bit more kind of, I don't know, like I almost want to say like authority based, where there's something that they believe on authority, whether from science or religion, but it's kind of a similar dynamic where it's like, this is truth, this is important truth, and you need to know this. And then if asked, well, how do you know that? I mean, like, I was actually talking to my wife just today about this kind of topics. Like, I mean, I don't know firsthand that I even have a brain. Okay, I believe that on authority, right? And that's fine, right? You can believe things on authority, you know, that's fine. But it's like I think some people have kind of more of a personality for like really wanting to see it for themselves, and if they can see it for themselves, like that's going to be the clearest. And so I don't know. I'm actually kind of curious, even just to hear more of your story, like kind of where you're at and what are your questions and what are you thinking about?
Yeah, so for me personally, like where I was, I think I'd kind of I'd had this YouTube channel when I was like a bit younger, and then I thought I was going to start it up and do some apologetics, right? And apologetics was what got me into studying philosophy as well. Like I'd basically just been drifting through my degree and not really that bothered about much until I became a Christian. I do think as well, maybe a part of that is I think there's so much really interesting stuff, like historically, culturally in there, and
Yeah.
that's cool to study. But a part of it as well was wanting to just be able to defend what I like. When someone says what you think someone rose from the dead or whatever, like, yeah, that
Hmm.
is pretty weird. How would you even go about like talking to someone about that? But then I came across, I don't know if you know Doug Pine Creek. He's
I
he's
do.
in the
He's a
chat now
Facebook friend.
watching as well.
Okay. Hi, Doug.
um, and I had a conversation with him, and in a lot of ways, I'm actually glad I had that conversation, because I
Yeah.
think the road I was on was one to a lot of weird fundamentalism, and my life would have been completely different. And he basically got me to realize, yeah, these things that I'm saying I know, I didn't really know. I didn't have, you know, like it, essentially a lot of it boiled down to subjective experience, say, which
Hmm.
is fine. I mean, like, I'm an epistemic idealist. I think that fundamentally all I've got is my own experience. But
Uh-huh.
then, but rationally though, I was like, things like, well, but if I've got a Muslim, like, I was going out on weekends doing street evangelism, and like a Catholic would come and say, well, and I'd be like, well, your faith is wrong because it's not the good, the Reformed
Hmm.
tradition. So your personal experience is demons or whatever. Or like a Muslim, when they say, I have this experience of green light when I pray, and I'd be like, or people doing yoga, like even secular people who like go and do yoga, and they're like, yeah, it's really great. And a year before I became a Christian, I would have been like, oh, this is cool. And then I slowly adopted the group's beliefs into being like, yeah, this isn't in the Bible, this isn't about Jesus, so it's
Hmm.
intrinsically bad or demonic. Um, I realized that, well, I don't actually have even having read The Great Pumpkin Objection many times, I still don't really, I can't say that person's personal experience is wrong, but
Right.
mine isn't. Like, I've got to be like, yeah, they're fine to have that, and that then undercuts the whole
Yeah.
theology of like, go out
I'm
there,
with you.
tell them they're wrong, get them saved.
Yeah.
And that was the first domino, I think, to topple. And then I started just thinking about, well, really, like, I'm saying the Kalam cosmological argument is good because it's what's in William Lane Craig's book, right? But
Yeah.
do I really know that everything that begins to exist has a cause? Why might I think that? Or do I really know the universe began to exist? Do I really know an actual infinity is impossible? Did I
Mhm.
even know what an infinity was at that point? Did I know
Right.
Cantor's diagonalization argument? Like, and then I just went down all these rabbit holes and realizing, like, well, I don't know as much as I think I know at all. And
Mhm.
and I think the emotional stuff was tied up in there as well, because of things that had happened in the church that I was at, and the way that had affected my personal life, people's theology. So there was an inclination for a while, I think, to push back against that. But
Yeah.
now I stayed in kind of agnosticism, and now like I really enjoy reading, say, Albert Schweitzer, and he's like
Mhm.
someone who he's like, well, I don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but actually when like when he's 30, he goes out there like Jesus did to live his life in ministry, building a hospital and serving people that way within the church still, and because of the ethic of Christ. And I think like what I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater of religion and Christianity, so to speak. But
Mhm.
what um, where I'm at currently is like, I don't know that I could ever be certain in the way that like someone like Augustine or Anselm was, or something like that. I think
Mhm.
things are very different. Maybe I could at some point in the future. Who knows? But I want to work out. I want to just work out how I can hold true beliefs,
Yeah.
how I can live in a culture that's heavily influenced by Christianity and not be like abrasive again. So like, I don't have set positions really right now. I've not
Yeah,
said
no, it
this,
totally makes sense.
but that's
Yeah.
like where I'm up to at the minute. Yeah.
Right. No, that's really cool, and I feel like I just wanna say again, that journey is very valuable, and it's just, it never ends because there's always more to see. And one thing that, I think about sometimes is in terms of kind of the difference between having a package that is, it's almost like an anchor where you kinda come back to that package and you think of new beliefs in light of that package, and, versus almost like you sort of let go of the package and you're just like facing reality. Just facing it's not like you're not facing a pre-existing package. You're just like trying to find, okay, like what is really true.
Mm.
And then it might be that in this process, you start picking up a few things that was in that original package, but not everything. And you might pick up some things with almost like different degrees of certainty. I think maybe this is kind of one of the worries and a legitimate maybe problem with religion characterized in a certain way, is that it can almost like create like a package that you have to sort of believe with 100% certainty, and it's all true. And then every other religious package is like all false. I was actually talking with somebody the other day about this, because we were having a conversation about religion, and I was suggesting that, well, maybe this belief in this religion is true, but that doesn't mean that this religion over here is 100% false. And then their response in that conversation was kind of more to think in terms of the sort of all or nothing approach. At least that was kind of how I was interpreting it. And that's tough, because reality doesn't sort of conform to any pre-existing package 100%. There's like reality. Okay, I have this picture of this infinite meadow with flowers, and each flower represents an instance of like truth, beauty, and goodness. And the meadow is like infinite. And this is reality that contains various truths, various goodnesses, and various beauties. It's infinite. And then I have like this other picture of like either a series of caves, or maybe even some cases like a mansion that contains a certain set of flowers. Maybe in the caves, the flowers can't flourish because it's like too dark in there or whatever. And then you have like these wanderers that come out of the caves or out of the mansion, and they start discovering, oh my goodness, like there's this infinite reality out there. Like there's more truth about ultimate reality, like significant things, than was ever contained in the system that I was sort of brought up with. And then you have like the apologists, okay? And I'm characterizing this in a certain way, okay? I don't mean to put like everybody under this characterization, but sometimes you almost have to exaggerate a picture to make a point. So the apologists come out of the caves and they say, come back, come back. It's dangerous out there. Like you might lose your salvation out there. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're liable to be lost out there. Come back, come back. And then you almost have this little bit of a worry, like, oh, maybe I should go back, what does that mean? And I don't know. It's like, I just want to keep coming back to this message. Like, you're on a great journey. We all are. We're in the place of the meadow where we're seeing that there are truths, there are beauties, there are things that are not contained in any cave or castle. I mean, not to say that there aren't these things in some of the caves or some of the castles, but there's always more. So that's kind of how I see it. That's sort of as a philosopher, and I can relate to your story. You've seen, I think, in the first chapter of my own book, I have a little bit of a similar story of having a view and then it sort of falling apart and realizing that reality is just like more complex. And it's not like, reason just sort of led me back to the original view. It sort of expanded my view of everything. And some original pieces came back for sure. But even in, I would say, like a greater form, if that makes sense.
And I think there's more going on in something like Christianity than just what the typical kind of caricature can be. Because so like for me, I guess I'm like, even if this way, this particular way of like mythologizing the whole thing and having this particular metaphysics and this particular set of morals doesn't work for me anymore, like being part of an ecclesial community where people want to come together to mythologize the highest good that they conceptualize, to talk about that together from all these different walks of life and what everyone else is going through, and like to sing hymns, say, and stuff like that. Like, I think there's something to that, even if religion is completely false, and it's just there's if all there is like an infinitely contingent chaos out there in the world, and we've just come to get, well, what we're doing there is we're passing up reality into, it's like a Nietzschean, like we're creating our own meaning, and that is still that even if that's all there is to it, there's no, it's not tethered to anything. It's still very important, I think, which is why I continue to participate in it. But another thing though is that I'm really concerned with is like, is it true? Can I know it's true? And I think that that's a big thing for you and your philosophical work. Like how do we actually get that tethering from, say, like like I enjoy, I have the good feelings from singing the hymns. I really enjoy Bible study. It doesn't, I mean, it doesn't have to specifically be Christianity, but like there's certain things about being a part of religion that, you know, say science is showing are good for our psychological well-being or something like that. But how could we actually tether it and say it's true?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think scientific methodology is extremely helpful in this, because the idea is you come up with hypotheses, then you make observations. And I mean, the only thing that I would want to add, so that our investigation is wide and not sort of narrow, is that the observations can include a wide set of data, including observations about your own consciousness, observations about distinctions between right and wrong, or even if there's questions about whether those distinctions are objective, at least you can observe that there's a sense of the distinction between right and wrong. There's a sense of something's gone wrong here. And those observations can be included in your set of observations, and then come up with hypotheses and just test them. And I think that does help. You know, I mean, in my book, of course, I do lay out a pathway where I show that by the light of reason, I think that you can see some principles of reason. In my view, I think that reason itself reveals the robustness of principles of reason. That is, for example, the principle that there are no contradictions that are actually true. I think that you can sort of see that principle in your mind by the light of reason. But I think you can also see something else which is significant, which is that this principle of non-contradiction, it doesn't depend on your mind, because like it was true even before you were born. You know, I mean, you might think, well, maybe it depends on somebody thinking of it. Okay, well, that's a separate issue, but it doesn't depend. It's a robust principle, you know. And so this is an example where if you sort of widen the net of the net of things that count as observations, includes observations of your experiences, of the light of reason and moral data. And I do think scientific method is a helpful way. I think it's difficult though, because it's almost like, this is sort of what I see is like people sort of circle certain golden truths and say, okay, well, like this is the truth. And so we need an epistemology that can get us to this truth. And it might be, going back to the Meadow example, that they're just like so many truths. It's not to say that some truths aren't more important than others. I mean, in my view, kind of the most important truth is the principle that loving people matters. Like, and I think actually the most important truths are actually the most accessible. You can sort of see them by many lights. But there are many other truths. And that I think that if you use a kind of scientific methodology, it can help you to get more truths over time in accordance with your own personal journey, because you're making your own observations, you're having your own hypotheses, which isn't to say that you can't successfully get to truth. I'm not saying it's all just subjective, but there is a kind of, I don't know, I feel like there's often a kind of tension between extremes, and then wisdom flows to the tension. And so there's a certain kind of tension between the kind of, it's all objective, like we have to find our facts through this one sort of method of fact finding, versus like it's all subjective and nobody can know anything, and all just hold hands. And it's like, well, I actually think that kind of both of those models have some truth to them, but that the truth sort of flows through the tension between them. You know, each person is individual. You have your own journey, but I do think there's an objective reality that you can find out about.
But when
So, I mean,
I
that's
suppose,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, I was going,
yeah,
like when you were saying, so there's certain principles like the law of non-contradiction, right? But then I mean, maybe you could challenge some of the people, but like I had Graham Priest on here, for example,
yeah,
and I'm not gonna for a second think that, you know, I can say, well, it just really seems true to me, Graham, you know, and that, you know, deal with that. And it like
well,
it,
even there, I don't mind it. I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah, it's fine. I was
Well,
just
I
going
was
to say
gonna
there's
like,
so much
yeah, go
out
ahead.
there that
Yeah,
there's kind of like this pluralism, like you almost fall into this skepticism and pluralism of like, well, it like I know things, and I must think I know them because I kind of act in the world. I'm not just kind of stalled, but like it seems to me like, well, for every plausible argument I can also because I can entertain the counter argument,
yeah.
like, and I could probably defend that as well if I were committed in some sense that I seem to be committed to the things I go in for. Like how do I really like get at the truth?
Yeah, no, and I was gonna say, I mean, even there, you know, I think what even Graham's gonna say is like, in general, for any given proposition, he's not gonna assume that the contradictory version, you know, is true. But there might be some weird cases where you have independent reason to make an exception and to have a different kind of logic. But a tool that I've used is to kind of start with what's most clear and then let the clear be the light into the unclear. And this kind of shows up in my work as well. So, and this is also personal because people are seeing from different angles and different perspectives, but start with what's most clear to you. So if you take, for example, I don't know, the hypothesis that Josh Rasmussen exists and doesn't exist, that's probably not as clear to you right now, given all your evidence right now, that I exist. Okay, so kind of have to go with what's most clear. Even now, let's say that there's something where it's not clear, because you can sort of think of a counter argument to that, and you really have no way of seeing which side is most clear. Then it seems like the intellectually responsible thing to do is just say, I don't know. And that's like, what else can I say? I mean, what else can I offer you? It's like, probably the best way to get to truth is just to do the intellectually humble and responsible thing, which is like admit when you don't know. That doesn't mean that there aren't times when you do know, or that you have at least good reason. I like to think of like weights in your mind, and then for every proposition, there's a scale. So let's take the hypothesis that consciousness exists. Okay, so I have reasons to think that consciousness exists. So one of my reasons is that I can like focus on a conscious state, like the state of feeling content, and then I focus on that, and it seems like that state exists. Okay, so that gives me a weight of a reason on the side of consciousness exists. But then I read the literature on eliminativist materialism, where philosophers, I remember when I was in graduate school reading all these different arguments, the Churchlands have these different arguments that belief in consciousness kind of comes from a folk ontology, and we want to think about this, and so they have ways of analyzing those arguments. And then when I start thinking through that, that maybe gives some weights. Or if you don't understand the arguments, just even the authority of smart people thinking that we don't have consciousness, that puts some weights over here. And then I just sort of add them up my own mind, and I say, okay, well, what's more likely given all my weights in my mind? And sometimes things sort of tilt on one side versus another. So when it comes to consciousness, when it comes to that there are some principles of reason that are true, that people have value, that racism is sort of problematic precisely because people have a kind of value that's equal across the races. So it's sort of problematic to treat certain races as more valuable than others intrinsically. And I have a sense of that. Now I'm open, maybe this is kind of your thought here, is like, you should always be sort of open to outweighing evidence. Yeah, exactly right. That's why the scientific method is helpful. And I don't know, I feel like if I could just add one more thing here is, I feel like sometimes there are communities that almost like wage war over a certain proposition, like whether God exists or whatever. But the war is actually a battle over something kind of more behind the surface of that proposition. Like it wasn't really about whether God exists. It was really about, are you actually following reason and evidence? Like, are you being intellectually responsible? So I was like, that's really what it's about, And I think even recognizing that can help kind of depolarize the conflict and maybe help people sort of become allies in the quest.
So would you say, so I was just thinking about some of the things that you're saying there, like it seems to me that saying I don't know is saying with something like Christianity, where you're called to action, to live a certain way, to act a certain way, and if you're saying I don't know, then you're not necessarily participating in that. Maybe you're a terrible example, playing Xbox on Sundays instead of going to church and doing whatever it is that you're meant to be doing. So is that, like if the truth is something that calls us to action, then isn't, or is there a contradiction between like your theology in a sense and where reasons led you there? Or I guess what I'm thinking is where it's, because in my mind there's kind of like this difference almost between things that I've come to on the basis of reason and things which would seem like theology, which seem to be more like authoritative or like I've never had a direct revelation of Jesus, say, something like that, whereas
or the belief that you have a brain is more
yeah,
based on authority. That's
yeah,
another example, right?
yeah. So how do you, especially with how do you get from this kind of like to actually putting your flag in the ground on some
Yeah.
actual issues?
Yeah. So let me connect this to what you said earlier about joining a community and this sort of ecclesiology. Um, so like when you're connecting with a community, even while you're uncertain about a bunch of things that maybe that community thinks is true, what is like motivating your action to connect with that community? Would you say it's that, well, at least you see some value in the connection? You see some value in the community?
Yeah, I'd say in a sense it sort of, I mean, I think there's there's value in real like person to person interactions and
Yeah.
being involved in each other's lives in at least a way that tries to be authentic. It's not
Yeah.
like whereas work relationships and things might just be that just a job or whatever, but this is people who are trying to be like you said, kind of salt and light to each other's lives,
Yeah.
like the real thing. And I think that for me, I'd see value in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the reason why I'm pointing to this is because I like how you said it. You see value in that.
Mm.
So you're seeing something. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like you have to see something to be motivated to take action. Otherwise there is a kind of duplicity there. If you sort of pretend, you act like you believe something, but you don't actually believe it.
Mm.
But I mean, here, what I hear you saying is that you actually do believe that there is value in that. And so even though it's like you're not believing maybe all these other things, there is still something that you believe. And it's based on a site of value. And I think that you are seeing value and that site of value is a basis of a true belief. And the reason why I'm pointing to that example is because I think sometimes the clearest things we sort of mistake the clear for the insignificant. And so we're almost like looking, well, I don't see over here, I don't see over here, but actually focus on the things that you do see, or at least that you think you see, and that's the clearest, and then see if you can sort of expand from there. I mean, I use reason as an example because I think that a lot of people in the audience can sort of relate to the sense that like 2 + 2 = 4 is true, and then what follows from that? Well, does 2 + 2 = 4 depend on whether you personally are thinking or that certain atoms in your brain are hitting your thought? It's like, well, no, you probably also think that 2 + 2, there were math exams and there were true answers to those exams, including 2 + 2 = 4, before you existed. It's like, okay, well, that implies something further. So you can kind of build and build and build, and who knows how far you can go, right? And so it's like here, well, there's some value that you're seeing. Oh, okay. Well, then it follows that value is real. At least some of it is,
But
and it
isn't it,
follows that.
sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
isn't it possible though for someone to use the same reasoning and then end up in like an ISIS camp or something, to the kind
Uh,
of, I see value in the community, and then 2 months later this is really true. 4 months later this community is opposed to that community, and then a
yeah.
year later that community needs to be done in or whatever. Like isn't it possible to lead to non-virtues but using the same kind of rules of inference there?
Yeah. So I think that's why it is helpful to have people who disagree with us as friends to sort of help check us.
Right.
I think that's why tribe it can limit you. I also think that, I mean, what you're pointing to is sort of a general problem, which is that no matter what method you use to get to truth, you can be misled. So like if
Okay.
you use the method of like, I'm going to believe at least what seems true, well, that can mislead you. I'm going to believe, what science tells me. Well, has science ever gotten anything wrong?
Right.
Or sometimes Christians will say, well, I'll believe whatever the Bible says. Okay, well, but I mean, the difficulty there is that
What does it
your
say?
belief, well, yeah, there's what does it actually say? How do you interpret it? Some people
Yeah.
disagree about that. But then even your belief that what the Bible says is true is itself based on beliefs about history, beliefs
Right.
about people's authority, and those can be misguided. And of course, and everybody can play that game. Like, no, my sacred text is the golden truth. It's like, well, if it's not, then you've just limited yourself because you're not letting any possible evidence shake you out of that. And I don't know. I mean, you mentioned Doug. I feel like that's one of the important things he helps people see
Mm.
is a kind of almost like psychological symmetry between maybe different groups And I think that can sometimes help shake them out a little bit of the group. And I think that can be helpful there. So, I mean, in other words, like there's no easy answer here. Like it actually takes courage to get to truth. So I think sometimes what happens is people go into the wilderness like, well, that's unsafe. You could go astray. It's like, well, yeah, welcome to the real world. Where if you go outside the door, you could get hit by, it's dangerous out there. But the people who do big things and do great things are people who actually have the courage, go out there and actually fail a lot in the process. Like you should fail a lot. You should have a lot of false beliefs on your way. I mean, we all have false beliefs, but it sort of takes that going out there to continue to grow and continue to look at different angles. I think that the worry that you're going to get into a cult is an important one. And I think one of the ways to sort of protect yourself from that is to always sort of allow people who are disagreeing with you to speak to you, to listen to people who disagree with you. Does that resonate with you? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking, kind of like, but are the, these problems of skepticism, I agree with what you're saying, but then it seems to me to be so prevalent that how can we say we know anything really? Like, so when because when it comes to especially something like God or maybe politics, like who I'm going to vote for next, or whatever, like things that are very important to us. So because we're acting, we're saying we have to have quite a high degree of confidence. But if that skepticism is so high that, as you were saying before with like the weights, that we can see, like where I am right now, for example, I can see how someone can have a completely coherent metaphysics and everything and is a theist. I can see how someone can do the same and be an atheist. So how I kind of, that there's a mind behind things or something, but it's that it's getting to say that I know that that's the case with any kind of confidence. How could you really get to that point whilst being aware of the skepticism and if the weights are kind of equal?
Yeah, this is hard because the journey is so personal. People see different things. I think one way that people limit themselves, I think one way of kind of organizing these questions is in terms of almost like removing limitations to being more powerful in your own journey. And I feel like one way that people sometimes limit themselves, we talked about tribalism, we talked about intellectual vice. Another thing is that sometimes I think people sort of wait for almost like a group of people to agree. And so they'll talk in terms of what we know. And the thing that's interesting to me, Nathan, is that what we know is like basically nothing. So in terms of what we agree on, and when I say we, I mean the experts. So the experts in the philosophy of mind do not know that there are minds. They do not know that there are physical bodies because there's not an agreement consensus yet about any of that. So we don't even know, as philosophers of mind, whether there are minds, whether there is knowledge, whether there's a physical world. But it doesn't follow, of course, that nobody has knowledge of that, or that you don't have knowledge of that based on your light. But I think it can be difficult because if the experts aren't agreeing, who are you to say that you know, right? I mean, especially if the experts don't know. But and I don't think there's really I don't see an easy answer to that, except that if you are just sort of honest with how things look to you, then you can actually have a view, and it can come in different degrees. You don't have to have certainty to think, okay, well, it seems like I'm going to say that I know this, or maybe you don't want to use the word knowledge, but it's like, it's more plausible than not. So, and you can come to that before you wait for the experts to agree. I guess that's kind of my main point. I think people limit themselves if they wait for expert consensus on every question.
Would you say this sort of almost limits the usefulness of so particularly with regards to like theism, then, to philosophically arguing about it, because it's more almost pragmatic in a sense? It's like, how is this really when it's lived out? Do I see value in it and stuff? Or do you think like actually figuring out whether the ontological argument works, is actually sound or not, is a worthwhile thing for people to do at the time?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because you're kind of pointing to maybe the greater value of people, the community, the virtues, even the pursuit sometimes than just like happening to see like the correct answer. That's hard for me, because philosophers, we really want to know what's true. And sometimes I will sort of preach to myself to sort of calm myself down. It's like, I'll say like, people actually matter more than what's true. Truth serves people, but I'm not saying truth doesn't matter. It's like, truth does matter. I'm just trying to calm myself down a little bit because I get kind of obsessed sometimes with like, oh, we have to get to the truth. I actually want to add something that could be a little bit encouraging about the possibility of success at getting to the truth. So I think what people don't see sometimes behind the academic halls when philosophers are thinking through things is they don't really see the success and the progress. And I mentioned philosophers, but scientists as well. I think a lot of times what people see is the kind of turbulent battle of ideas in the popular sphere. And they see that not much truth is sort of flowing across camps, like each camp sort of digs in. And so they don't see a lot of progress. And it actually creates this feeling of almost like hopelessness, like nobody can really get to the truth. But in my experience, working kind of with philosophers, when people are working on trying to get to the truth together, they tend to get more truth over time. And I can give you lots of stories, lots of examples where I'm in dialogue with somebody and my view begins to expand, certain beliefs get rearranged, even removed, their belief expands, and where we started out in disagreement, we actually came to a kind of alignment over time. And I've actually had this experience so many times that when I first would hear people say, oh, we just have to agree to disagree, it would bother me because I would say, no, we don't. Like, let's have a conversation for a year and we'll work it out. This happens. But I think part of it is like people actually, they don't know how to do that. And they don't have that experience. And I think for me, in my experience, the way that it actually happens is through what we've talked about, the intellectual virtues, removing the sort of limiting things like appealing just to authority, not seeing it for yourself, being polarized, and then just really setting that aim together. Okay, let's see if we can learn more together, being allies in the quest. I have this book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? Talk about like the big questions, and that book was a co-author dialogue book between me and a philosopher who is really worked in the field, is published in the field. And he took a more skeptical stance. And I took a more optimistic stance. And through the course of the book, we divided it into 3 parts. And at the end of each part, we talked about what we learned from the other person. And we learned things. Like we both gained, I would say, truths from each other through that process. And even on the question of God, what was sort of stunning to me was that we even clarified like the meanings of terms so that there was a certain alignment about our view about ultimate reality, where even though there are still important differences and distinctions, there actually are also some important substantial points of agreement about the nature of ultimate reality. That there is an ultimate reality, that it's infinite in some sense, that it transcends the material world in some sense, that it even has a kind of consciousness or proto-consciousness, and that principles of right and wrong and logic are eternal and part of the fabric of the foundation of reality. Like that's a set of points that we sort of came to see sort of together, and some of those things, obviously, we maybe came into the dialogue thinking were true, but some of those were sort of new ways of characterizing our views, and we came into a greater alignment. And this does happen, I think, when people make truth their aim. It takes time, takes work, but I do think that I almost like do want to leave you with a little bit of an optimism that you're on a good path. Like you are getting more truth. Like even seeing that some of your previous beliefs weren't probably correct is a form of progress. Like that's a form of seeing something new, or seeing the value of a community. That's seeing something, that's seeing value.
Yeah, I've often thought over the past month or so that sort of if God does exist, I think that where I'm at now would be a better or maybe a more well-developed understanding of that thing than where I was going before. Because I was, if I were to think about an infinite, a mind which knows all things or something like that, I wasn't going in that direction. I was going in the direction of, a mind which knows, only one thing, and that's Jesus, doesn't know about any,
Doesn't
And
see the infinite meadow of
yeah,
truth, beauty, and goodness.
or the nuance that there is to like cultural context, say for example, if
Ah,
there is a God that sits outside of time in a way that everything is present with it right now, then um I'd think it'd be more familiar with the kind of cultural nuances of our day versus and I think you see that in the Bible as well, like a vastly different culture and throughout
yeah.
the Old Testament into the New Testament. And yet what some people want to be saying is, no, we have got it right with this
Mm,
particular little slight. And so a roundabout way of saying that, I think I think if there is a God, going through this process of actually deconstructing my beliefs would be something that has brought me closer to it in some sense.
mhm.
I don't know if there's anything you want to
I know
come
what
back
you
on
mean
that.
by
I've got
that.
some questions
Yeah, I do want to
relevant.
add one thing to that. I find it kind of helpful to think of different cultures as kind of having a lens into ultimate reality. And it's not to say that like all lenses are sort of equally saying the same thing or anything, but actually quite different than that, that people are seeing different things. And then people have to interpret what they're seeing. And then sometimes what can happen is that people will sort of draw circles around what they're seeing and say, well, this is like all of ultimate reality. And then somebody else will see a different sort of aspect of ultimate reality. And they'll say, no, this is all of ultimate reality. And then you get this phenomenon of like, well, everybody has their own God. And it's unlikely that all, it's like each God is unlikely. And so it's sort of unlikely that your one version of reality is the true version. And it's like, I think that's an important critique. And so I think it is actually very helpful to kind of have that intellectual humility and sort of realize that people are seeing different things from their own cultural lens. And one thing that I've experienced, Nathan, just by having lots of conversations across people, different Christians, different atheists, different religions, is that sometimes there's some interesting substantial overlaps that are conceptualized differently so that people think that their views are very different. That's like the phrase, oh, their view is very different. But then you sort of unpack like really what you mean, then you find out there's some really interesting substantial overlaps. Now, this isn't always the case. I'm not saying that there aren't important differences. I'm not suggesting that, um, but that there can be sort of hidden substantial overlaps that I think people miss when they're sort of in one frame.
Well, this is something like just this morning. I was reading a bit of Genesis and Isaiah, and I was reading some of the parallels between other ancient Near Eastern myths and what's going on there in
Yeah.
the Bible. And I think to a lot of my kind of Christian friends, some of that stuff would have been quite threatening to say, well, this bit, this author who's in this kind of section and this author who's compiled this little bit seem to be influenced by, say, this particular ancient Near Eastern myth or this particular ancient Near Eastern myth,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the creation accounts. But then there's enough significant difference that you can see it's relevant to, once you understand the relevance to the people where they were at, but then
Yeah.
enough of the shift that you get this other lens on what they're really trying to talk about there. Or like even in there was this bit in Isaiah where Jerusalem's kind of meant to be like the wife and Yahweh the husband, and she's kind of, it's in the later Isaiah, written about 200 years after or something like that, after
Mm-hmm.
actual Isaiah. And she was saying something like it, because the Jerusalem's meant to be in exile, and it's like propaganda almost of how God's sovereign, so it restore the thing. And she's saying, you're the one who cut up Rahab or whatever, and oh, you're the one. It like cut up these ancient primordial gods, and it's like, hang on, that's not Christianity. That's not Thomism. That's like ancient Near Eastern, like weird creation out of people being chopped up. That's not even what's in Genesis. Yet at the same time, this little reflection of like what would have been
They were
relevant to the people
thinking.
at the time, yeah, what they were
Mm-hmm.
thinking at the time. It just gives you that extra lens where you're like, yeah, what this thing is like bigger historically than just my kind of conceptions from being taught science and English in 2000 to 2010 or something, and that's
Mhm.
the small window of people I came across. Like there's more to human knowledge than what's just encapsulated in that.
Yeah, that's well put.
I might have just gone crazy while I was talking then. It's a bit late over here. So,
That's cool.
one of the questions someone put across were, well, this was Doug actually. He said, you spend a lot of time on deism / general theism.
Mhm.
Let's drill it down. I really want to know if Josh believes Jesus rose bodily from the dead, hold no belief sacred, including the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, I tend to think in terms of kind of what would I expect on theism, and I was thinking kind of about this recently, actually, in terms of what kind of a world we're in. And I think story is a helpful device for organizing a lot of complex information. And if you start thinking about like what makes a good story, well, there's characters, there's plots inside plots, there's drama, there's tension, there's character development, soul development, and so I think, well, if there's a supreme mind at the sort of foundation of reality, this increases my expectation that the kind of reality that's going to unfold is going to be consistent with the supreme mind. It's going to be glorious, going to be awesome. It's going to involve, I would think, a kind of story, an adventure. I don't mean like a fiction story, but like a true story, a real story with many characters. And then when I started thinking, like, what would be like the greatest story? Well, I started thinking, well, it kind of makes sense that the greatest story would involve tension, conflict, even the greatest character coming in to a scene to display the greatest kind of love. And when I start sort of filling this out, Richard Swinburne, he's got this argument from sort of the nature of God and the concept of God that leads him to think that something like God coming into the human story to display a message of love, forgiveness, redemption is actually not so implausible. It's not so unexpected. I think sometimes people focus on a particular event and say, well, that would be unlikely given all that we've experienced. And I think that could be right. But then if you scope out and you think, okay, well, what kind of a reality would we expect to flow from the sort of supreme being? Then it seems like my prior expectation that there'd be something like Jesus coming in into the human story as God. That leaves open lots in terms of details. And I think I would kind of almost rather in this context just sort of leave that open, because I mean, I have open questions for myself, but also I feel like it's helpful to sort of sort like which truths are clearest and even matter more. And so it seems to me like the idea that we are part of a soul building adventure, your journey matters, your life matters. Those things I care a lot about. I think those are important truths. And I do think this has implications that are more specific to the historical details with respect to Jesus. I mean, if you look at the kind of historical evidence, but I mean, the reason why I'm emphasizing the story is because I think in a lot of these debates, and Doug is familiar with these debates, they get kind of caught into the weeds of the historicity. And I'm not saying those aren't important weeds, but they leave out the sort of framing, which is, I think, necessary for even investigating how you interpret those things. It's not like if my neighbor says, I gave birth to cats, it's like, well, I don't have any kind of prior expectation that my neighbor would give birth to cats, even if God does exist. So there's a difference there. So some events I think would be against my expectation, so it's going to take like extraordinary evidence, right, because it's an extraordinary claim, whereas other events would be more sort of fitting to my prior expectation if God exists.
So what would like in this kind of context, saying that like and that resonates with me, but with the more with people who would identify as atheists and be against that, and they'd be saying well, just believe in stories, like what is this, like how would you get that across to how would you get that message across to them
True
when
stories.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I
So
don't
is that
know.
where the history matters more kind of thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because truth sort of involves the whole person, and this includes not just truths about shapes or even historical events. It also includes truths about values. And it is interesting when you look at movies it's not just sort of random, like which movies sort of rise to the top. I mean, there are themes. People study these things. I have a friend who does script writing, and there's kind of rules of the trade, how you make an awesome show. You don't just put together like noise out there. You don't have random characters doing random things. You have a kind of progression, and this will involve conflict. This will involve tension. This will involve heroism. And so, I mean, it's almost like I want to start with something more universal that anybody from any perspective can sort of see by their own light, and then sort of ask them. I'm sort of about like empowering each person to kind of use their own tools. Like, I'm not trying to get people to see it all my way, but like, here are some tools you can use, which is this tool of seeing value played out in a story, and then look at history and see if there is a kind of drama, a story of human beings, and then if that sort of fits one worldview more than another. I do think, let me just kind of add here, kind of a bit of modesty. I do think that if you have independent reasons to doubt that God exists, or you lack sufficient reason to think that there is a supreme foundation or a supreme mind, then it's going to be harder to have a expectation that the story is going to unfold in a positive direction. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of different arguments in play, and each person, of course, is aware of different things. That's part of what makes it complex. I don't know if that helps. Kind of a
Yeah,
lot
no,
there.
thanks for no.
Yeah.
I think it's a good answer, and no one's been responding to that in the chat. So the next question someone's asked is, they're saying that they think they missed what you said by values, epistemological values, and then I suppose something I'd want to add on to that is, are they something that you just kind of presuppose in a way, or you'd say we have to kind of reason those values in there before?
Yeah, so that's good. I think you experience value kind of directly, sort of in the way that you experience your own thoughts and feelings. It's not like I first look at my brain and then infer, those are the neurons that generate thoughts, so I must be thinking. It's like I have more sort of direct access to that. And I think it's the same way with values and virtues. I think you can actually experience that truth seeking is valuable. It's good to be rational. It's good to be intellectually humble. It's good to be kind to others. It's good to look at things from other perspectives. It's good to grow. And I think actually that is what sort of animates the debates. That's what gives the debates energy. It's precisely that people are actually feeling, seeing, experiencing values. And I think one of the things that gets complex is that people will see there's so many values, and so people will see different values. And so this will lead to kind of tension. And I think it takes wisdom to sort the different values. It takes listening. It takes a lot of experience, So that's my basic answer would be, it's experience. You don't have to presuppose it. You sort of experience it.
How much time have you got, by the way, to answer these questions? Just I don't know.
A few more minutes. How much?
Okay, sure. I've got like 5 questions at the minute. I don't know if any more. I didn't want you to,
Sure.
like if you've got to be somewhere or something. I don't know. I didn't want.
I've got a little more time.
Okay, cool. So I think earlier, maybe you might have said something about science. I don't know if you remember, and someone said, people don't see progress in science. I feel like science is the place where progress is the most obvious of like any human endeavor. Is there any comment you want to kind of pass back on that? Or?
Yeah, just a little bit. So I think there's value in that. I think people tend to see progress in the areas that they're kind of almost like most aware of. And so, I mean, I think there is immense progress in mathematics. There's also progress in philosophy that I think is people aren't really aware of it, because philosophers, we sort of advertise our disagreements. But I mean, I would say there's progress in epistemology. For example, there was sort of this idea that you have to falsify your principles in order for them to be credible. And this was sometimes put forward as a demarcation between science and like metaphysics. And I would say that's a case where the philosophers working on that have diagnosed the problem with that principle and have tweaked our understanding of that in a way that has led to real progress, where there's actual consensus. But I think what I kind of want to say is, like, I think people have different strengths and different personalities, and that it's almost like it's better to lean into your strength and your personality. So for me, we were talking before the show that we're both sort of I was a computer science major, and you're doing computers and stuff. And So I'm sort of like interested in sort of thinking about things sort of analytically. Even when I was a programmer, it's like, how do I build an algorithm? And math was always my favorite subject. And whereas like my wife, I mean, she's really great at math as well, but she's also great at sort of keeping track of like lots of information in a sort of a library in her mind. And I've got friends like that. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. So you should lean into that and use that. And I think that people who are kind of science minded, they have certain skills and strengths that allow them to sort of see the progress of science, and they should lean into that. But I think that there is also progress in mathematics through a priori reasoning, also through philosophy, through logical reasoning. And I kind of gravitate toward that. And I think that it's good for me to sort of lean into that because that's kind of my area. But so it's not really so much a competition like, well, science is the best way or philosophy is the best way, but that there are actually many good ways and people are kind of stronger in different fields. That would be my basic thought about that.
Awesome, thanks. And then another question is, beside your books, what other books would you suggest reading?
William Rowe is a fantastic philosopher, and he's got a book on the philosophy of religion that is really good, sort of introduces you to the field. One of my favorite philosophers is Michael Huemer. He's got some work in kind of across different fields, politics. He's got this book, Skepticism Behind the Veil, and that's on epistemology. I would recommend that book. You know, that's a really helpful book. And he actually supports the view, Nathan, that you articulated in terms of kind of paying attention to how things seem to you and sort of let that sort of lead you. But
is that a phenomenal conservatism?
Yeah,
is that
that's right?
Because I had an interview for a scholarship that I applied for, and I'd cited something of Michael Huemer's, and they asked me if I knew what phenomenal conservatism was, and my mind went blank, and I just was like, well, it's about, you know, like with phenomenology and being conservative with it.
Nice. Yeah, you start with sort of how things seem, and you sort of build from there. And his work on that is excellent. I mean, I would highly recommend that. And then sort of, I would say, follow your curiosity. I know that's maybe sort of simple advice, but I think it's important advice. I mean, because your curiosity will lead you to the things that will be kind of most significant for you.
So someone has asked maybe a more philosophically inclined question here. Does God have thoughts? If so, are they contemplated or processed in any way? Also, what good are thoughts to an omni-being?
Yeah, so one thought that I've had about thoughts with respect to ultimate reality is that it could be that there are sort of like these necessary principles, these sort of necessary truths of logic, as well as of perhaps right and wrong, and that these necessary principles are sort of built into the fabric of the foundation, and that they are thoughts or thought-like entities. They're like thoughts, at least in this sense, is that they have a kind of aboutness to them. You know, in thoughts, you sort of inspect a thought about zebra is oh, there's an aboutness to it. And when you have like thoughts like nothing can be both true and not true at the same time, that's about truth. It's about propositions. There's a kind of aboutness to that. It's a kind of conceptual reality. And so I would sort of think of the sort of necessary principles of logic and of right and wrong as built into the fabric of the foundation. And I'm happy to call those thoughts. I mean, or thought-like. I mean, in my book, I call them thought-like things. They're not maybe thoughts in the sort of way that like we have thoughts, in the sense that they're contingent, or that they're dependent on prior material states or something, or activities. Although it could also be that God can have contingent thoughts that are based on conceptual activities. So that's something that I would think is pretty plausible.
So we've got
Actually,
just...
I want to add one more thing to that.
Yeah, you go.
My sort of working hypothesis. So I have hypotheses with different degrees of probability. So my current working hypothesis is that there are two kinds of thoughts related to God. One would be these necessary truths, which are kind of built into God's nature. And then the other would be contingent things. And an example of these would be contingent laws of physics. So these are laws of or about physical interactions, and that these are reflections of God's contingent thoughts.
Awesome. So we've got 3 more questions if you think you've got time.
All right, let's
then.
do it.
So someone has said, the resurrection and virgin birth to me seem like your neighbor giving birth to cats.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, it's going to I actually want to affirm that. This would be a good moment for me just to affirm that different people are going to have different expectations based on their prior beliefs. So, I mean, that's why I was saying I've got a prior reasons to think there is a sort of the supreme mind, and then an expectation that reality would unfold in a way that's adventuresome, and that there would be a kind of tension in the heart of history. So that's going to affect my probability estimate. But I really want to affirm that you can have rationally different estimates of the prior probability there.
Awesome. Then we have another question. What are the strongest pieces of natural theology? Maybe.
These are great questions. And I'm not really sure how to answer that, but strongest pieces.
I mean, what even
Yeah.
is what's the project of natural theology even about for you?
Yeah, so sometimes people distinguish sort of revelation from natural revelation, where natural revelation would be your ability to sort of see truths through nature, but nature understood broadly. So this will include the light of reason and looking at the nature of the world, the nature of the abstract landscape. And as far as the sort of strongest pieces, I don't know. I mean, I do sort of tend to gravitate towards kind of what does the light of reason reveal about even the nature of logic itself and the sort of fundamental nature of existence. And I do think that you can see truths there through that. That's a great question. It deserves more thought on my part in terms of the strongest. Maybe I don't tend to rank things in terms of weak and strong, especially because this is sort of my personality, but I tend to see strength as relative to persons. So some things that some Thomists will think are like the strongest pieces of natural theology, I might say, well, I don't know if that's the strongest piece of natural theology. But I guess in my own view, it would be kind of what reason by its light can reveal about the abstract landscape. I'm 100% sure that consciousness exists and that there are abstract principles and that you can see these by a light of reason.
And then the last question then we've got here is from Doug, who has said, do you believe in the bodily resurrection? Circle 1, lean yes or lean no.
That's funny. The bodily resurrection. Well, see, this I'm going to have to kind of play hard to get here because it all depends on what you mean. So there are various ways in which there can be technologies that lead to different physical configurations where some people would say, oh, that doesn't count. That's not a miracle in the sense of violating the laws of physics. I sort of tend to think that you don't have to violate the laws. There's actually different rules of reality, and especially if laws reflect God's thoughts. So it's like God has different hierarchies of thoughts. So I mean, I have no problem with God having certain thoughts which permit a bodily resurrection through, what I want to say, without violating the laws, but some people say, oh, well, that doesn't count, because resurrection by definition is supposed to be a violation of the laws or a miracle. And so that's not what I wouldn't affirm that. But it looks like on the evidence that I have considered and then factoring in my prior probabilities, I would find that plausible. And it's also related to a feature of stories, which is that in stories, there are often sort of revelations that kind of can be exposed over time. And it's like, what's that verse? It's the glory of God to conceal an idea, the glory of kings to search it out. I don't know if I've misquoted that or not, but there's this idea that there's something valuable about discovering something over time. And so the reason why I'm putting it this way, and it's not that I'm trying to avoid a direct answer, it's just that I think it is just very helpful to realize that there can be truths that are almost like supposed to be discovered. and different people can discover them in different ways. It's like part of almost like the romance of life or something like that. It's like part of the story.
Yeah, I do appreciate your answer, but I also apologize for when Doug inevitably isn't happy with it and makes a little clip of you not saying yes or no or something.
Oh, that's fine. It's no problem.
So yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else you want to say then before we wrap this thing up?
No, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate connecting with you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
awesome. Yeah, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I'll end the stream there.